I had been driving since early morning, the sun climbing slowly across the highway and turning the asphalt into a ribbon of heat under my tires. By the time I spotted the flickering neon sign of the motel, the sky was dark, a deep, heavy shade that made the streetlights look sharper, almost harsh. The sign buzzed faintly, the letters barely legible, a few bulbs dead, but it promised a room for the night, and that was all I needed. My eyes stung from the long hours on the road, my shoulders ached, and the muscles in my legs were tight from keeping them in the same position for so long. The idea of stretching out somewhere, even somewhere clearly past its prime, was too tempting to resist. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars that looked like they belonged to long-term tenants rather than travelers. Gravel crunched under my tires as I rolled up to the small office, the smell of stale air and something faintly chemical greeting me before I even stepped inside. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, and then hummed steadily, casting a harsh white glare across the cracked linoleum floor. Behind the counter, the clerk looked up briefly, his eyes tired or disinterested. It was hard to tell. He didn't smile, didn't offer a word beyond the mechanical handover of the key. It was a tiny metal key, the kind that rattles against the chain in your pocket, with a tag marked 207. I nodded, mutely thanked him, and made my way to the stairs at the far end of the building. The staircase creaked beneath my weight, the steps worn and uneven, each footfall echoing faintly through the empty night. By the time I reached the second floor, I was ready to collapse, my arms full of a small bag I had hastily packed, my body hungry for a bed. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning chemicals, the walls a faded beige streaked with shadows where the light barely reached. The door to my room was heavy, its paint chipped at the edges. I inserted the key, turned it, and the lock clicked with a dull, unceremonious sound. Inside, the room was modest, nothing more than a bed, a small dresser, a chair pushed into a corner, and a window with threadbare curtains. The air was warm and still, carrying a faint scent of dust and previous occupants, but it was clean enough. I dropped my bag onto the floor and sank into the bed, pulling the thin blanket over me with a sigh. Sleep came slowly. My body was still wound tight from the drive, and every little sound seemed amplified. Somewhere far off, a car door slammed, a dog barked, a highway truck rumbled over a distant overpass. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and I drifted into a light, uneven sleep, the kind that leaves you aware of the world around you even as your mind slips into rest. It was just past 2 a.m. when I woke to it, the first faint sound, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought it might be the wind, the old building settling, or the natural creaks of the floor above. But then I heard it clearly, footsteps. Heavy, measured, moving across the floor directly above me. Not hurried, not fleeting, but deliberate and slow, each step pressing down on the floor with a weight that made the bed frame vibrate slightly beneath me. My chest tightened immediately, my pulse spiking, and I froze, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The steps didn't just cross the floor. They circled, pausing briefly in places that made no sense for a normal person walking straight across a room. I could hear the faint dragging of soles against the floor, a subtle scuff with each turn, like someone was deliberately pacing, testing, circling. They moved directly above my bed, then across to the dresser, then to the corner of the room, then back again. I pressed my ear to the ceiling, straining for more detail, trying to discern whether it was one person or more. There was no rhythm, no pattern that made sense, only a slow, careful presence that seemed to respond to me moving or even breathing. Every time I shifted slightly, the steps would pause, as though the person above had noticed. I lay there, rigid, barely daring to breathe, the room around me suddenly impossibly quiet except for the oppressive weight of that movement above. My mind ran through explanations, an overly cautious neighbor, someone staying in the room above who had a strange walking habit, but none of them felt right. The steps were too deliberate, too aware. It was as if the person knew exactly where I was, tracing the outline of my room without ever stepping into predictable patterns. Time stretched. Minutes became endless. I couldn't focus on the clock, only on the sound, trying to pinpoint each turn and shift. My hands gripped the blanket, so tightly it left impressions in my skin. The air in the room felt thick, almost tactile, heavy with the metallic tang of anxiety and the faint, stale odor of the room itself. I wanted to call the front desk, to knock on the ceiling, to do anything, but my body refused to move. There was no threat I could name, no justification for running, yet I couldn't bring myself to lie there passively. Eventually, the footsteps slowed, and for a moment, there was silence so complete it made my ears ache. Then a faint dragging sound, like someone moving a chair carefully, followed by nothing. I stayed pressed to the bed, eyes wide, chest heaving, barely able to hold myself still. I realized then that I wasn't going to sleep again that night. The fear wasn't from ghosts or monsters, it was something entirely human. The knowledge that another person had been moving deliberately in the space above me, responding to my presence without ever showing themselves. I spent the rest of the night alternating between sitting on the edge of the bed, pacing quietly along the room's small perimeter, and lying back down with my ears trained on the ceiling. When the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, everything felt impossibly still. No footsteps, no dragging, no hint of anyone ever having been above me. I stayed in the bed, exhausted, unable to move for a long while, my mind replaying the night over and over. By mid-morning, I finally mustered the courage to leave the room. The clerk was gone, the parking lot empty except for a few cars. I didn't linger, didn't look back at the building. I drove off slowly, eyes on the road, listening for any sound that might hint someone had followed me, until the highway opened up and the routine of travel began to pull me out of that fog of fear. It wasn't until hours later, when the rhythm of the road and the warmth of the sun had reached me, that I could think of the motel as just a building with worn floors and inattentive clerks, a strange episode to remember rather than a present threat. The footsteps had been real, deliberate, and human, but they were gone, and that alone was enough. I never returned to that stretch of highway, and I never stayed in another roadside motel without carefully checking the layout and the sounds around me. The memory of those slow, circling steps stayed with me, a sharp reminder that the world is often perfectly ordinary, and yet capable of making you feel completely exposed, completely watched, even when you are alone. I had been on the road for hours, driving through stretches of highway that felt endless and empty. The sun was already low, burning orange against the horizon, and I knew I wouldn't make it to my intended destination before dark. I started looking for a place to stop and rest, not caring much about the quality of the motel, just that it would have a bed and a lockable door. That's how I ended up at a small, aging motel tucked off the highway, the kind that seemed like it hadn't changed since the 70s. The paint on the exterior was peeling, the neon sign flickered unevenly, and the asphalt in the lot was cracked with weeds growing through. I pulled into the lot, noticing a few cars scattered here and there, some looking freshly used, others looking abandoned, with flat tires or missing hubcaps. I parked near the office, got out, and carried my bag inside. The lobby smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and an old, lingering scent of cigarette smoke. There was a bell on the counter, a small TV mounted high on the wall, and a single chair by the window. I rang the bell, waited a moment, and a man appeared from a back room. He looked tired but polite enough, and without saying much, he handed me a key with a small plastic tag. The hallway leading to my room had a low ceiling, the kind that makes you feel slightly crouched even when standing upright, and the carpet was a dull, nondescript brown that seemed worn down from years of foot traffic. My room, number 14, was at the far end, and when I opened the door, I was hit with a faint chemical smell mixed with something else I couldn't place, slightly sweet, vaguely metallic. It reminded me of old cleaning products mixed with the faint smell of rusted pipes. The room itself was small but functional. The bed was neatly made, sheets crisp but not fresh, the mattress giving a little too easily when I pressed down with my hand. There was a small dresser with a cracked mirror, a desk with a lamp, and a TV that looked like it hadn't been upgraded in a decade. The bathroom was compact, its tiles slightly chipped, the sink stained at the edges where calcium had built up over years of use. I set my bag down, stripped out of my travel-worn clothes, and ran a shower. The water was hot and sharp, the smell in the bathroom growing stronger as steam filled the room. I shook it off, thinking I was tired and maybe overreacting to the stale smell. After the shower, I sat on the bed, scrolling through my phone to check messages, though reception was spotty. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rattling the window, and I could hear the faint hum of cars on the highway, though they were few and far between. That's when I first heard it, the sound of keys jingling, soft but deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my door. I froze, listening carefully. It was brief, a few seconds, then silence. My stomach tightened. I got up slowly, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Empty hallway. Dim light from the ceiling fixture above, the same worn carpet stretching on either side, and no sign of movement. I chalked it up to imagination, tiredness, maybe the wind carrying some noise from somewhere else. I tried to settle back onto the bed, telling myself it was nothing, but the sound came again a little later, more insistent this time. Keys jingling, soft metallic clinks as if someone was testing the lock. I didn't move at first, just listened, heart thumping, telling myself I must be imagining it, that maybe it was someone at a neighboring room fumbling with their own keys. But the sounds weren't from another door, they were coming directly from mine. I checked the lock carefully, sliding the deadbolt into place and testing it a few times. Solid. Nothing had been tampered with. I even placed my bag against the door, just a precaution, then sat back down, trying to ignore the sense of being watched. The night stretched on slowly. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway made me flinch. Every muffled thump or drag of a cart in the distance felt amplified. I tried to read on my phone, tried to convince myself the jingling keys had been some fluke or a dream. It happened sporadically, sometimes long gaps, sometimes just moments apart, but each time it startled me out of sleep or focus. I never saw anyone, never heard a voice, and the hallway was always empty when I checked. I found myself pacing the room quietly, testing the locks repeatedly, listening to my own breathing, the occasional sound from the highway, trying to distinguish reality from fatigue. Eventually, sleep came, restless and shallow, punctuated by the familiar metallic tinkle in my dreams, or perhaps from the hallway. I woke a few times during the night, heart hammering, the sensation that someone was just outside lingering even when nothing was there. When morning finally arrived, the sunlight was weak and diffuse, cutting through the dusty blinds. I dressed quickly and went to the front desk, intending to ask if there had been any maintenance work or staff moving through the hallway during the night. The clerk looked at me with a puzzled frown. He shook his head when I explained the noises. No one had been in the hall, no maintenance staff, no lost keys, nothing. "All keys are in my pocket," he said simply. He sounded sincere, and for a moment I questioned my own memory. But I had felt the sound, heard it long enough to be convinced it wasn't a hallucination. I left the motel feeling unsettled, the jingling still echoing faintly in my mind. It never happened again, and I never found an explanation, but I told myself it didn't matter. The room was secure. Nothing was missing. I had locked the door. I spent the rest of the drive thinking about it, turning over the sensation of someone or something testing the lock, leaving, doing it all in silence, as if watching, as if marking the room in some way I couldn't see. It was completely real. The sound had come from somewhere. Whether it was a guest who had sneaked in unnoticed, a staff member breaking protocol, or something else entirely, I would never know. The story stayed with me for weeks. Every time I passed a motel, a hotel, or even a locked door, I thought of those faint metallic jingles in the dark hallway. I never stayed at that motel again, and I never returned to that stretch of highway at night. It was unsettling because there was no storybook ending, no confrontation, no dramatic revelation. It was just reality, an ordinary place, ordinary people, and one inexplicable, quietly terrifying event. I could still picture the dimly lit hallway, the worn carpet, the closed door with the deadbolt firmly in place, and the feeling of someone, or something, just outside, moving with quiet intent. And that was enough to make the memory linger, as real and as unnerving as anything I had ever experienced. I arrived at the motel, just as the last hints of sunlight were fading behind the horizon. The place looked older than I expected from the photos online. A low, single-story building with a faded red roof and a row of cracked windows that reflected the dimming sky. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of older cars, and the asphalt was uneven with patches of weeds poking through the cracks. The fluorescent sign flickered intermittently, buzzing quietly, which gave the whole place a slightly unsettling edge, though I tried to shake it off as just being tired from the long drive. I pulled into a space close to the main office, opened the door, and felt the sudden chill that seemed to linger in the shadow of the building. The office smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning chemicals, an odd combination that somehow felt worse than either scent alone. The clerk was behind the counter, his movements deliberate, almost slow, but I was too distracted to read much into it. I handed him my ID and credit card, took the key, and followed the narrow corridor to my room. The hallway carpet was dull and frayed, the walls yellowed and scuffed from years of wear. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and with each step, the low hum of the bulbs pressed against my ears. There was a faint odor, something I couldn't place, but it felt like it had been lingering here a long time. When I opened the door to my room, the first thing that hit me was the carpet. Near the corner of the bed was a dark stain, irregular in shape, spreading across the dull beige fibers. At first, I told myself it was probably just old wine or some other drink, a leftover from a previous guest, though it was darker and more concentrated than I expected. I set my bag down slowly, trying not to think about it. The room itself was basic: a double bed with a worn comforter, a small nightstand, an old TV that sat atop a crooked dresser, and a window with heavy, faded drapes. The air smelled faintly musty, but underneath, there was something metallic, almost like iron, but so faint I could barely register it. I tried to relax, unpacking only a few essentials. I turned on the lamp by the bed, letting its weak yellow light fill the corner with the stain. The edges of it looked darker under the light, almost wet, but I couldn't be sure. I told myself again, it had to be some old spill. I set my phone on the nightstand, checked the time, and tried to read for a while, though the words blurred in front of me. Every so often, I felt the tiny, prickling sensation that someone might be watching. It didn't make sense. The room was empty, the motel almost deserted. I sat on the edge of the bed, scanning the room. The stain caught my eye again, unnaturally dark, and a sense of unease settled heavier in my chest. Sleep came slowly, fitfully, every sound outside the window, every creak of the building sending a jolt through me. Around midnight, I woke again, the sense of being observed stronger than before. The air felt heavier, like the room had shrunk, pressing closer. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling, and my eyes kept drifting to that corner. Eventually, I decided I needed to see it more clearly. I turned on my phone's flashlight and crouched near the bed. The stain was wet, not just damp or faded. There was a sheen to it, reflecting the phone's light in a way it hadn't before. My stomach tightened, and I leaned closer, noticing the smell. It was subtle but unmistakable, metallic and sharp, like blood. My pulse spiked. I stepped back, scanning the room again, half expecting to see someone crouched in the shadows. There was no one, but the carpet's wet patch stayed there, dark and glistening. I checked the door. It was locked, the window shut. I pressed my fingers into the stain tentatively, just enough to confirm it wasn't some illusion. Cold, wet, unmistakable. I couldn't reconcile it with the empty room. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, every little noise echoing unnaturally. The air conditioner cycled on and off, sending occasional gusts of cold air that smelled faintly of rust and dust. Every few minutes I would glance at the corner, half expecting the stain to have spread further, half hoping it was just my imagination. By the time the sky began to lighten, the metallic smell seemed stronger, almost invasive, and my sleep-deprived mind felt frayed and tense. I didn't dare touch anything else in the room. I dressed quietly, careful not to brush against the bed, and grabbed my bag. I left the room without looking back. The lobby clerk was still at the counter, glancing at me briefly as I paid, but I didn't stop to say anything. Outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dry leaves and asphalt warmed by the early sun. I got into my car, feeling the residual tension from the room cling to my skin. I started the engine, and as I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that dark, wet stain. I told myself later it could have been anything. Maybe a cleaning chemical spill that hadn't dried properly. Maybe an accident the staff had missed. I imagined scenarios over and over, each more plausible than the last, each still leaving the metallic smell in my memory. Even after days had passed, I could picture the corner of the room in sharp focus. The sheen on the carpet, the way the light hit it, the heaviness in the air that made sleep impossible. I never went back, and I avoided that chain of motels entirely after that night. The experience stayed with me because of its quiet, mundane horror. There was no one lurking, no explanation that felt satisfying in the moment, only the stark, undeniable presence of something wrong in an ordinary room. It was the kind of fear that doesn't need monsters or ghosts. It's the kind that creeps up slowly, grounded in a real, tangible world, leaving you hyper-aware of the slightest detail and unwilling to ever ignore a small, dark stain in a motel carpet again. I checked into the motel late in the afternoon, driving straight through from a long day on the road. The building was small, low, and set back from the highway, with a faded sign that swung slightly in the wind. The parking lot was mostly empty, cracked asphalt with a few weeds pushing through the edges. The clerk barely looked up as he handed me the key, his eyes tired and flat. My room was on the second floor, and the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet, a mix of cleaning products and something I couldn't quite identify. The walls were a pale beige, scuffed in places, and the light above the door flickered once when I opened it. Inside, the room was simple and functional. A thin mattress sat on a metal frame, and the bedding was clean but slightly stiff, like it had been pressed and folded for a long time. There was a small desk under the window, a plastic chair tucked neatly beneath it, and a cheap lamp that gave off a harsh yellow glow. The carpet was a muted brown, worn thin in a few spots near the door. The room smelled of detergent, a faint chemical scent I assumed was from cleaning, but beneath it was something subtle, almost sweet and sour, that I didn't recognize. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was just a quirk of the building or some lingering fragrance from the cleaning products. The bathroom was tiny, smaller than most motel bathrooms I'd stayed in. The floor was linoleum, smooth and shiny, and the tiles on the wall were an off-white with faint gray grout lines that had darkened over time. There was barely enough space to stand between the sink and the shower, and the toilet seemed too close to the wall, angled in a way that made the room feel tighter. I noticed the smell was stronger there, a mix of bleach and something else that I couldn't identify. I thought it might just be residual cleaner from the housekeeper, so I ran the fan and opened the small window, hoping it would dissipate. I washed my hands, brushed my teeth, and took a quick shower, still shrugging off the smell as an odd but harmless detail. After settling in, I turned on the lamp by the bed and tried to relax. The room was quiet except for the occasional hum of an air conditioning unit from the building next door and the distant murmur of traffic along the highway. I checked my phone, scrolled through a few notifications, then set it aside and turned down the covers. The mattress was firm but not uncomfortable, and I thought I might sleep well despite the long drive. I left the light on, mostly out of habit, because the hallway outside had a faint yellow glow that made the shadows in the room feel deeper. I set my bag against the wall and lay back, closing my eyes. A few hours passed, and I drifted in and out of sleep. Then I noticed the smell again, stronger now, sharper and more distinct. It wasn't just bleach. There was something cloying underneath, almost like rotting fruit or something fermenting. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was imagining it, that it was just the lingering scent of cleaning chemicals reacting with the heat from the lamp. But then I noticed movement at the edge of my vision. The shower curtain, which I was sure I had pushed fully closed, was slightly pulled aside. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough to catch my eye. My stomach tightened. I hadn't touched it. I didn't hear anything. The room was still, and yet the curtain had shifted. I sat up slowly, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I told myself there was a draft from the small bathroom window, or that it had fallen naturally, but the evidence didn't match. The curtain was light, and the rod didn't look like it would allow it to shift on its own. I listened intently, but there was only the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant road. My eyes remained fixed on the bathroom, noting the way the curtain swayed slightly. The smell was stronger now, more pronounced, and my stomach churned as I realized I could pinpoint it more clearly. It was sweet, almost like overripe fruit mixed with some chemical undertone. I felt a twinge of nausea, but forced myself to breathe slowly. I got out of bed carefully, not wanting to make any sudden noises, and moved closer to the bathroom. My bare feet felt cold against the carpet. I leaned forward, holding my lamp above my head, shining the light directly into the shower. Nothing. The tiles were clean, the curtain was still partially pulled aside, but there was no one there. I ran my fingers along the rod. It was sturdy and stationary. The drain was clear, the faucet dry. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the smell and the curtain. I backed away, unsure whether to call the front desk or convince myself it was all in my head. I decided against it, telling myself it was probably just a combination of cleaning chemicals and a draft, that I was tired and sensitive to smells after driving all day. I returned to the bed, leaving the light on, and tried to sleep again, though I kept glancing toward the bathroom. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shadows stretching across the tiles or the curtain moving just slightly, and the sweet, sour smell seemed to grow, invading the corners of the room. I stayed on the edge of consciousness, drifting in and out, hearing the faint creak of the building settling, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional thump from above, though I knew the upper floor was empty. My mind cycled through explanations: air currents, old plumbing, maybe a pest behind the tiles, or just my imagination heightened by fatigue and travel stress. Morning came slowly. The light outside began to filter through the blinds, and the hallways smelled of breakfast from the small cafe below. I hadn't slept much, and my body ached from lying tensely all night. The smell had lessened by daylight, almost gone entirely, leaving only the faint chemical trace of bleach. I turned on the bathroom light, inspected the space carefully. Everything was in place, the curtain pulled back slightly, but nothing was out of order. The tiles, the sink, the toilet, all clean, nothing spilled or out of place. I ran my hand along the shower rod, tested the curtain. It moved freely, but showed no signs of having been tampered with. I even bent down to check the drain and the corners of the floor. There was no residue, no wet spots, no sign that anyone had been there. I packed my things, took one last glance around the room, and left. The day was clear and quiet, and the motel lot looked empty, except for a single maintenance truck near the office. As I drove away, I felt a lingering unease, but also a kind of relief. Nothing had actually happened. I hadn't seen anyone, nothing had been damaged, and the room itself was normal, but the memory of that night, the smell, the curtain, and the feeling of being watched by an empty space stayed with me longer than I expected. It reminded me how easily the mind can fixate on small irregularities, turning them into something larger than reality, and how even ordinary places can hold subtle, disorienting details that unsettle you simply because they don't make sense at first glance. The motel disappeared behind me, quiet, unremarkable, yet I knew I would remember that faintly sweet, sour, chemical smell and the slowly moving curtain for a long time, the night stretching out in my memory like a narrow corridor I had walked alone. I had been on the road for nearly 12 hours when I finally pulled into the motel. It was the kind of place that seemed to have been there forever, a long, narrow building stretched alongside a quiet side street. The neon sign flickered intermittently, buzzing softly in the otherwise still night. I parked my car at the far end of the lot and walked slowly toward the office, my feet crunching on the gravel. The air smelled faintly of oil and something else I couldn't quite identify, a lingering scent that made the entire place feel older than it probably was. The clerk handed me my key with a quick nod, his face barely illuminated by the dim overhead light, and I made my way to my room on the second floor. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed them, a hollow, high-pitched sound that seemed to echo down the length of the building. I carried my bag slowly, taking note of the way the fluorescent hallway lights flickered every few seconds, leaving patches of shadow that made the carpeted corridor look uneven, almost alive. My room was toward the middle of the building, and when I slid the key into the lock, the mechanism groaned faintly, a sound I would come to notice more than once. Inside, the room smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the mustiness of old carpets and faded curtains. The bedspread was thin, the sheets slightly coarse, but everything was clean enough. I dropped my bag on the bed and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. By around 2 a.m, I had been half asleep, lying on my back and staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above me. That's when I first heard it, a sound so subtle I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing somewhere down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under some unseen weight, a rhythmic pattern that, for a terrifying moment, seemed to match my own heartbeat. My eyes shot open, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The sound continued, slow and precise, passing in a rhythm that shouldn't have been possible if I was alone. I waited, straining to hear beyond the gentle hum of the fan, but the hallway remained cloaked in darkness, the light from my room spilling out faintly into the corridor. I got out of bed, bare feet sinking slightly into the threadbare carpet. I moved toward the door, hand trembling slightly as I gripped the knob, and cracked it open. The hallway was empty, just as I had feared, and the silence seemed heavier once I realized no one was there. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but every creak from the long wooden planks beneath the doors echoed in my ears, too distinct and deliberate to be random. Then I noticed it. The doorknobs on nearby rooms were turning slowly, almost cautiously, as if someone was trying each door quietly, testing them one by one. I froze, my hand still resting on the edge of my own door, my breathing shallow and rapid. The motions were so subtle that I almost doubted what I was seeing, but the slight click of each latch, the minute movement of each knob, confirmed it. Someone, or something, was moving down the hall, methodically and deliberately. I retreated quickly into my room, closing the door with a sharp click behind me. My hands shook as I slid the chain lock into place, checking the deadbolt twice to make sure it was secure. I moved to the far side of the room, away from the door, sitting on the edge of the bed with my knees pulled up, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps continued, now moving away from my room, passing slowly down the hall. Each creak of the boards made my stomach tighten, and I could hear the faintest scraping sounds, like someone's fingers brushing against the edges of the doors as they went. I kept my eyes fixed on my door, expecting at any second for it to rattle or shake. Minutes passed like hours, every second stretching into an eternity. I did not move. I did not breathe too loudly. I did not dare to blink. Eventually, the sounds faded slightly, moving further down the hallway, and I allowed myself a quiet exhale. But the relief was only partial. The thought of anyone having been in the building, so close, so methodical, made my skin crawl. I turned my head slowly, trying to convince myself that maybe it had been maintenance or another guest, but the careful, deliberate turning of the doorknobs could not be explained away by chance. My phone lay on the bed beside me, its screen dark, but I didn't dare pick it up. My instinct was to stay still, to avoid drawing attention, and I listened intently as the hallway seemed to settle back into an uneasy silence. I stayed like that for hours, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, feeling the weight of every second. My mind replayed the sounds over and over, the slow creak of the floorboards, the quiet turning of the knobs, the soft echo that seemed to come from the far end of the hallway and move closer again before retreating. I thought about leaving, about trying to slip out unnoticed, but every scenario I imagined ended with me caught, with someone, or whoever had been there, realizing I was awake. I counted the hours in my head, marking time by the slow, persistent flicker of the fluorescent lights outside my door. I did not sleep. I barely blinked. I simply waited, pinned by a sense of helplessness and a fear I could not name. The first light of morning was a pale, washed-out gray that filtered through the thin curtains. The world outside seemed distant and impossible, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the hallway and the suffocating silence I had endured. I did not hear any sounds once the sun had risen. The floorboards were quiet, the doors still, the hallway empty. I opened my door cautiously, keeping my eyes fixed down the length of the corridor, and stepped out. The only signs that anyone had been there were the small scratches on the knobs and the faint indentation of footprints in the dusty carpet, barely visible but undeniably real. I descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, and reached my car in the lot without seeing a single person. The parking lot was empty, the flickering neon sign buzzing softly in the morning light. I left the motel immediately, driving slowly at first, glancing in the rearview mirror as if expecting to see someone following me. I did not stop to look back at the building. I did not return for months. The memory of those slow footsteps, of the doorknobs turning one by one in the dark, stayed with me long after I had driven away, a reminder of the quiet, patient presence that had shared the hallway with me for hours. I never figured out who or what it had been, and I never wanted to. The experience left me certain of one thing. I would never stay in a motel on the second floor of a long, narrow building again. I pulled into the motel just after 10 in the evening, tired from a long day of driving. The highway had been quiet for hours, except for the occasional truck or another lone car. The neon sign flickered weakly in the foggy light of the street lamp, advertising vacancy. The building itself was small, 2 stories, with faded paint and chipped concrete steps leading up to the doors. There was a faint smell of oil and damp asphalt around the parking lot, and the air carried a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. I had booked the room online earlier that day, hoping for a brief stop to rest before the last stretch of my drive. When I entered the room, I immediately noticed the musty smell. It was a combination of damp carpet, stale air, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. The carpet was worn thin in places, and the wallpaper had curled slightly at the corners. The bedspread was patterned with an outdated floral print that looked like it had been common in the 1980s. The lamp on the nightstand flickered a little when I switched it on, casting uneven light across the room. I dropped my bag on the floor, turned the key in the lock, and closed the door, feeling the quiet settle around me. My window faced a narrow alley between the motel and the neighboring building. From my angle, I could see part of the wall of the next building, the gutter running along the edge, and the small fire escape ladder. I pulled the curtains slightly, not expecting much, and settled into the bed for a few minutes, letting my body relax after the long hours on the road. Outside, the wind rustled lightly through the alley, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and garbage. Around midnight, as I was adjusting my pillow and half dozing, a flicker of light caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from a passing car or a street lamp bouncing off a window, but it came from the window of the room next door. It wasn't constant. It flickered, dimming and brightening like someone was turning a lamp on and off or adjusting the blinds. I sat up, my back pressing against the headboard, and watched. The room was small, much like mine, and the window was partially open. For the first few minutes, I assumed someone was moving around inside, maybe coming and going, checking the time, or using a laptop near the window. But then I noticed something strange. Every time I shifted in bed or reached for the lamp on the nightstand, the flickering stopped briefly, then resumed in a different position. The figure in the window, or whatever it was that caused the light, seemed to pause, almost as if it had noticed me. My pulse quickened, though I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. I turned on the lamp fully, the light spreading across the room and over the bed. For a moment, the window across the alley was dark. I moved a little closer to the window, trying to see clearly, and the light flickered back on, the shadows in the room shifting just so. I realized I could make out a vague silhouette, tall, thin, moving slowly. The movements didn't make sense for someone doing normal tasks. The silhouette seemed to freeze when I looked directly at it, only to shift slightly when I glanced away. My stomach tightened. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling a layer of sweat despite the cool air from the cracked window. The carpet beneath my feet felt rough and scratchy, grounding me in reality, but the alley outside seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it had absorbed all sound. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone adjusting their curtains or a reflection from a light on the street. Maybe the angles just made it seem like the figure moved with me. But the way the shadow adjusted, almost like it was watching, made my rationalizations feel hollow. I moved to the bathroom, hoping that leaving the main room for a few minutes would make the tension fade. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, harsh against the dim, warm glow from the flickering lamp in the bedroom. I washed my face with cold water, feeling the rough towel against my skin, and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection was pale, my eyes wide, and I realized how tense my shoulders had become. Returning to the bed, I noticed the window again. The silhouette was closer to the glass, though the curtain remained partially drawn. Every instinct told me it wasn't supposed to be there, that it shouldn't be moving the way it was. I tried to distract myself, pulling out my phone to scroll through news or emails, but the faint light flicker kept catching my eye. Every time I looked up, the shape seemed to shift in response to my movements, always just slightly out of place, never behaving like a normal occupant of the room. I felt my hands tremble as I considered what to do. I thought about calling the front desk or the police, but it was late, and I wasn't even sure anyone would come. The idea of knocking on the door of the room next door, explaining myself, felt ridiculous and unsafe at the same time. After what felt like an hour, though I'm sure it was closer to 20 minutes, I decided I couldn't stay. My body was tense, my mind racing, and every sound from the alley made me jump. The scrape of metal from the fire escape, a bottle rolling along the concrete, the faint rustle of wind against the walls. I packed my bag quickly, feeling the carpet scratch against my hands as I pulled clothes from drawers and shoved them inside. The lamp flickered one last time as I zipped my bag closed. I left the room, locking the door behind me, and moved down the narrow hall to the stairwell. The motel was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. I could feel the cool metal of the railing under my fingers as I descended the stairs 2 at a time. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for my car, and the night air was sharp against my skin, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and oil. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat for a moment, listening. The motel seemed impossibly still, almost waiting. I started the engine and drove off, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement in the alley, but there was nothing. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, and the tension in my chest slowly began to ease. I kept glancing at the motel in the distance, its flickering sign growing smaller as I drove. I didn't stop again that night. I didn't look back. I just focused on the road, the hum of the tires against the asphalt, the occasional passing of distant headlights, and the slow, steady feeling of moving away from the place where I had spent an hour feeling watched. By the time I reached a larger town a couple of hours later, the anxiety had begun to fade, replaced with exhaustion and the relief of distance. I checked into another motel, this one newer, cleaner, with a room facing the street instead of an alley. I unpacked slowly, laying out my things carefully, and this time, when I pulled the curtains, all I could see was the dim glow of the streetlights and the passing cars. No flicker, no shadow, no watching presence. I climbed into bed, my body finally able to relax, and slept through the rest of the night. The next morning, the memory of the alley and the flickering figure was still there, sharp in my mind, but it had been replaced with the knowledge that I had removed myself from that situation, that I had acted quickly and safely. I drove on, carrying the story as a quiet reminder of how strange and unsettling even ordinary places can feel when the night is quiet and you are alone. I was driving late on a quiet country road, the kind where the darkness feels heavier because there are no lights except for the occasional farm or the faint glow of distant towns. I had been on the road for hours, trying to get as far as possible before the long drive left me too tired to concentrate. Eventually, I saw a small sign for a motel tucked behind a curve, almost hidden by the overgrown grass at the roadside. It was one of those old motels that seemed like it hadn't been updated in decades. The neon sign flickered weakly, just enough to be noticeable, though some of the letters were burned out. I didn't care about appearances. I was exhausted, and the idea of a bed for the night outweighed any reservations about the building's condition. I pulled into the empty parking lot, noting immediately that there were no other cars. Not one. The lot was cracked and uneven, weeds growing through the asphalt in jagged lines. I parked near the front office, got out, and noticed the faint smell of mildew and old cleaning products lingering in the night air. The building itself was low, a single story with a narrow walkway in front of the rooms. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed intermittently. The windows were small, and the curtains in some rooms hung unevenly, sagging from the rod. I walked to the office, which looked deserted at first glance. I found the door unlocked, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of damp carpet and old air freshener, and the counter was cluttered with a few dusty pamphlets and a small register. I found the key to my room in a metal box behind the counter. No one was around, and I assumed the night clerk had gone home early or was simply in the back. Room 12. I followed the narrow hallway to the end, noticing the faint hum of the old air conditioner in the walls. The carpeting was worn, faded in some places, frayed along the edges. The walls had the faint marks of years of scuffs and fingerprints, and the wallpaper had started to peel near the corners. The door to my room looked solid, though the paint was chipped around the edges. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and flicked on the light. The room was small, nothing fancy, just a bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and a small TV perched on the corner of the dresser. The bedspread was thin, patterned with muted greens and browns that had likely been fashionable decades ago. I set my bag down and switched on the lamp on the nightstand, casting a warm circle of light around the bed. I didn't notice anything strange at first. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution mixed with the inevitable mustiness of an old building. I showered quickly, brushing my teeth, and crawled into bed. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, a soft, deliberate click. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, a gentle but distinct click, like a key or a latch being tested. My heart rate picked up. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the door, listening. The handle was still perfectly still. The lock was engaged. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the door. Silence. I returned to bed, telling myself it was my imagination, the sound of the old building settling or the wind playing tricks against the door. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself to sleep. After a few minutes, the click came again. This time it was more persistent, like someone was trying the lock in intervals, stopping when I moved and resuming when I settled back into bed. I got up again, checking the lock carefully. Nothing had changed. I even shook the handle slightly, tested the deadbolt. Everything was solid. The pattern continued for hours. Each time I approached, the sound stopped. Each time I returned to bed, it would start again. I was exhausted, but I couldn't ignore it. I began pacing the room slowly, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the door frame was warped, and the latch shifted slightly with the temperature. Maybe the old lock was sticking. But the way it seemed to stop the moment I moved toward it made me doubt any ordinary explanation. Eventually, I decided I needed some kind of security. I dragged a chair from the corner and wedged it firmly against the doorknob. I tested it, pressing my weight against it to make sure it wouldn't slip. Satisfied that it would hold, I returned to bed, though my body was still tense, my ears straining for any sound. Hours passed slowly, the clock ticking in the corner. I eventually dozed, though every half hour or so I woke to the faintest creak from the direction of the door. Each time I opened my eyes, I could see the chair still pressed against the handle, and I would reassure myself that I was safe. Morning arrived with muted gray light filtering through the curtains. I rubbed my eyes and slowly sat up. My first thought was relief, that the night was over, and I could finally leave. I got out of bed and went to remove the chair, intending to leave immediately. That's when I noticed it. The chair had been moved. Not far, just slightly, but enough that the seat no longer rested flush against the doorknob. I pressed my hand against the edge of the chair and the handle. My stomach sank. The chair hadn't moved on its own. It was heavy, and the angle of the door made it unlikely that it could have shifted from the slightest breeze or settling of the floor. I took a deep breath, walking carefully around the room, checking the windows and doors again. Everything was as it should be. Nothing else was disturbed. My bag was exactly where I left it. The bed was untouched. But the chair had definitely been nudged. The logical part of my mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the building shifted slightly in the night, or maybe the floor was uneven and the weight of the chair caused it to tilt. But I knew with a sinking certainty that wasn't the case. Someone or something had tested the door while I was asleep. I packed my things quickly, keeping one hand near the door handle, and left the room. I checked out at the office, but no one was there, and I dropped the key into the box as I had received it. I walked back to my car, glancing at the building one last time. The lot was empty, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly. I started the engine and drove away, the echo of the clicks still lingering in my mind. Even now, when I think back, I know it wasn't imagination. I was the only guest in that motel. No one else could have been there without my knowledge. The movement of the chair confirmed it. The clicks weren't random, they were deliberate. The thought that someone had been just outside my room, testing the lock while I slept, makes the memory of that night stick with me. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a story from a book. It was real, and it was terrifying because it was entirely possible, entirely human. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly through flat, featureless countryside. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the faded paint on the roadside buildings look even more worn. I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from hours of concentration and the monotony of asphalt, and I started scanning for a place to pull over. That's when I saw it, a small, old motel tucked just off the highway. The sign was faded, the letters peeling, but the light above it flickered just enough to catch my attention. It didn't look like much, but at that point I didn't care. I needed a bed, a shower, and a moment to stop thinking about driving. The parking lot was cracked, weeds sprouting through the asphalt, and there was a faint smell of oil and something musty, almost like damp carpet left out in the rain. I pulled into one of the empty spaces and killed the engine. The night air was cool, carrying the faint hum of the highway in the distance and the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass. I got out and stretched, my shoulders tight from hours of gripping the wheel, and then walked up to the office door. It opened easily, revealing a small, dimly lit reception area. The carpet was threadbare, the walls a dull beige, and a ceiling fan spun lazily above, rattling occasionally. The clerk, an older man with thinning hair and a permanently furrowed brow, barely looked up as he handed me the key. There was no smile, no small talk, just a brief nod and the wordless gesture toward my room. The hallway to my room was narrow, the carpet worn thin, with faint stains that had long since lost their color. The walls were painted a pale off-white, chipped in places, and the ceiling lights flickered intermittently. I carried my bag to the second floor, the steps creaking under my weight, each one letting out a hollow groan that seemed far louder than it should have in the quiet building. When I reached my room, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately noticing the faint smell of cleaning chemicals mixed with a lingering mustiness. The room was small, with a double bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and a small television in the corner. The bedspread was faded, the sheets slightly rough but clean. I set my bag down and exhaled, letting the tension in my body release in a slow, shaky breath. That's when I heard it, a soft knock at the door. My first thought was that it was a mistake, that maybe the clerk had sent someone by, or the next-door neighbor had knocked on the wrong door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I ignored it. A minute passed. Then again, the knock came, soft but insistent, deliberate in a way that didn't feel random. I froze for a moment, listening. There was nothing beyond the occasional flicker of the overhead fan and the distant hum of traffic. I moved to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The empty hallway stared back at me, the dim light casting long shadows along the walls. I pressed my ear against the door for a moment, but there was no sound, No voices, no movement, just the quiet of the old building settling. I tried to shake it off and went about unpacking a few things. The knocking stopped for a while, replaced by a different sound. The occasional, almost imperceptible tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the doorframe. I told myself it was the building itself, the wood expanding and contracting in the cool night air. I sat on the bed and pulled out my laptop, trying to distract myself, but the tapping continued, sporadic and irregular. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the room, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every time it stopped, I would hold my breath, waiting for the next tap. I lay down eventually, trying to focus on the exhaustion that had brought me here, telling myself that I would sleep and that the night would pass like any other. But I kept hearing the taps, faint at first, then a little more deliberate. Sometimes it came in quick bursts, almost like someone was testing the edges of the door, pressing lightly then retreating. My mind ran through possibilities, the wind, a loose window latch, a bird trapped somewhere, but nothing fit exactly. The room felt smaller with each sound, the walls closing in as I stared at the ceiling. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, the kind of hyper-awareness that comes from being alone and tired in an unfamiliar place. Hours passed. I dozed intermittently, waking each time a tap echoed in the room. The floorboards in the hall would creak occasionally, and I would hold my breath, waiting for footsteps, but there was nothing. The world outside was silent, save for the distant, occasional rumble of a truck on the highway. Morning came slowly, the sun filtering through the blinds in a muted wash of yellow and gray. I felt drained, every muscle tight, my nerves frayed from the tension of a night spent listening to walls and doors. I went down to the office, the hallway feeling longer in the light of day, every stain and imperfection of the carpet more noticeable. The clerk was behind the counter, staring at some papers as if he hadn't moved all night. I asked him if anyone had been in my room, my voice low, cautious. He looked at me like I was crazy, blinking a few times before answering. Not since I had checked in, he said. Just a simple shake of the head, like the question was absurd. I felt a flush of relief mixed with confusion. Had I imagined the knocking, the taps? Had I been so tired and on edge that the building itself had played tricks on my mind? I returned to my room to pack up. The air smelled the same, faintly chemical, faintly musty. The bedspread was rumpled, my belongings untouched. Everything was in its place. Nothing had been moved, nothing taken. I paused, listening one last time, half expecting to hear the taps again, but the room was silent. I stepped out, locking the door behind me, and walked down the hallway with a careful eye on the peeling paint and the flickering lights. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint smell of the highway and distant fields. I loaded my bag into the car, took one last look at the small motel, and realized I would probably never understand exactly what had happened that night. There had been no one, at least not physically, but the experience had left a lingering unease that I couldn't shake, a tension in my shoulders and a quickening in my chest that stayed with me long after I turned onto the highway. Driving away, I felt the relief of movement, the comfort of the familiar hum of my own car, the predictability of the road stretching ahead. The motel receded in the rearview mirror, small and unremarkable in daylight, but its silence stayed with me, and the memory of that first knock and the soft tapping remained, an unexplainable, grounded unease that was entirely real, entirely human, and entirely unforgettable. I pulled off the highway just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the sky a dim wash of purples and grays that made the long stretch of asphalt ahead look endless. I had been driving for hours, the hum of tires on pavement and the constant rush of passing trucks gnawing at my concentration. I needed a break, somewhere quiet enough to rest, but still close enough to get back on the road early. That's when I noticed the small motel sign, flickering weakly in the last light of day, announcing vacancies in peeling white letters. The building was low and squat, set back from the road with a narrow gravel lot in front. I turned in, the tires crunching over loose stones, and immediately noticed the white van parked by itself at the far end, separated from the few other cars scattered near the entrance. Its paint was dull, chipped in places, and the windows were tinted so darkly I couldn't see inside. I assumed it belonged to a contractor or someone working nearby, probably staying overnight. The motel itself had that faintly sour smell that older motels always seem to carry, the mingling of carpet cleaner, dampness, and lingering cigarette smoke. I parked near the middle of the lot, far enough from the van that it didn't feel threatening, and went inside to check in. The lobby was small, cluttered with mismatched furniture and a faded rug that didn't quite reach the edges of the tile floor. The clerk didn't look up much as he handed me the key, and I noticed a stack of old newspapers on a corner table, the headlines yellowed and curling. I carried my bag to the room, the hallway light flickering once as I passed the cracked mirror on the wall, and stepped into the space that would be mine for the night. The room was simple, unremarkable, a bed pushed against the far wall, a nightstand with a phone, a small lamp that hummed faintly, and a dresser with a cheap TV on top. The carpet was beige, mottled with darker patches that I didn't stop to inspect. I set my bag down and drew back the curtain over the single window facing the parking lot. At first, I barely noticed the van in the distance, the low evening light washing it into shadow. I unpacked a few things, brushed my teeth, and sat on the bed, letting the quiet settle in. I was tired, but the road had left me jittery in that low, nervous way that comes from hours of isolation and constant motion. Hours passed slowly. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. I could hear the occasional car outside, but the lot remained mostly still, the white van sitting silent like it had been for hours. Around midnight, I went to the bathroom and noticed that the window was slightly frosted from the cool night air outside, distorting the shapes in the lot. I stared at the van for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was harmless. It wasn't moving. No one had emerged. The engine was off. And yet, when I finally lay down in bed, I felt the strange, inexplicable awareness that someone might be watching from the shadows of that vehicle. I told myself it was just fatigue, my imagination running wild, but the feeling didn't entirely leave. Sometime after 1 a.m., I woke to a sudden burst of light. My eyes snapped open, and I saw the headlights of the van flare on, bright and piercing, for just a second. The room was flooded in that harsh glow, and for a heartbeat, I could swear I sensed the weight of someone looking in, waiting. Then the lights went out, and the room sank back into darkness. I held still, listening for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing except the soft, distant hum of the highway beyond the motel. I kept my eyes on the window, straining to make out the van, but it remained motionless, engine off, lights dark once more. Sleep came in fits after that, restless and shallow, the ceiling above me shifting and darkening as my mind replayed the brief flash of headlights. I thought about what it could mean, a glitch in wiring, someone checking their surroundings, a coincidence, but none of it settled. The motel itself felt heavier now, the shadows clinging to corners, the faint smell of carpet and old smoke sharper somehow in the silence. Every time I shifted, I caught a glimpse of the van's outline through the curtain, and my stomach sank a little further. Around 2:30, I got up to drink some water, careful not to make too much noise. The carpet was rough beneath my feet, the lamp flickering as I passed. I peered out the window again, trying to see if the van had moved, but it hadn't. It was like it was waiting for something. I sat by the window, my knees pulled to my chest, and kept watch. Every creak of the floorboard from other rooms, every distant vehicle on the highway, made my pulse spike. Hours passed slowly in that half-light, the motel now seeming more enclosed, more isolating than before. By 4 a.m., I had had enough. I packed quickly but deliberately, making sure to leave nothing behind. The van was still there, silent, its presence pressing against my awareness like a low thrum. I felt exposed stepping out into the lot, the gravel crunching under my shoes, the cold morning air biting at my face. No one else was around. The white van sat in the same spot, motionless and opaque, and I felt a creeping sense of relief as I slid into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The highway ahead stretched into the gray light of dawn, empty and forgiving. I didn't look back at the motel as I pulled onto the road, only noticing in the rearview mirror that the van remained, alone in the lot, waiting in its own stillness. The strange, anxious tension I had carried all night began to ebb with the motion of the car, the hum of tires on asphalt familiar and grounding. I drove until the sky lightened fully, the road straightening and widening, and by the time I stopped at a roadside diner hours later, the motel was just a memory, a dim shape in the early morning light. I never saw the van again, and whatever it had been, I realized I didn't need to know. Its quiet presence had been enough to make me aware of the vulnerability of being alone in a strange place, of the way subtle, human attention, watching, waiting unseen, can unsettle even the simplest night. The rest of my trip passed without incident, but I carried the memory of that single night for a long time, the image of the white van parked far from the other cars, silent and patient, headlights flicking once, enough to make the familiar motel room feel unfamiliar and unsafe. I never returned to that stretch of highway, and I never stopped at another roadside motel alone in the dark. It was the kind of fear that didn't need explanation, only awareness, and it stayed with me, quiet and real, long after the road had taken me away. I pulled off the highway just as the fog thickened into a low, gray wall that made the road behind me almost vanish. The headlights barely cut through it, and the neon sign of the motel appeared suddenly, a faint glow in the haze. One flickering bulb, the word vacancy buzzing in uneven bursts. The lot was empty except for a single old pickup truck parked near the office, paint peeling, tires caked in mud. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and something sour, like an old leak in the building's plumbing. I hesitated only a moment before pulling into a spot, the tires crunching on gravel that seemed to swallow the sound of my engine. The office looked smaller than I expected, cramped between two long, low wings of rooms. Inside, the air was warm but stale, carrying the faint scent of bleach that hadn't quite scrubbed the corners clean. The clerk was behind the counter, a young man with a pale, tired face, almost disappearing into the shadows of the room. He didn't speak, just slid a key across the counter toward me, a cheap metal fob with the number 7 stamped into it. I took it, paid in cash, and headed toward the back of the lot. Room 7 was on the far end, the kind of door that had clearly seen decades of use. I noticed the chipped paint around the edges, the scuff marks from shoes and luggage, and the way the doorframe sagged slightly on the left side. When I opened it, the smell hit me immediately, a mixture of damp carpet, old wood, and something faintly chemical, like cleaning solution masking mildew. The air was cool, the room dimly lit by a single ceiling light with a cracked globe. The bedspread was thin, faded beige with darker stains that didn't immediately register. The floor had a rough carpet that had been vacuumed at some point, but retained the sticky feel of years of traffic. I set my bag down and let my eyes roam. The room was small, the layout simple. A bed against the far wall, a nightstand with a lamp that flickered weakly, a dresser that leaned slightly as if pushed by too many heavy hands over the years, and in the corner, a small television perched on a metal stand. It had that old boxy shape, a black screen that gleamed when I walked past. I turned it on out of habit, but the image wavered immediately. Snow, static, the occasional jumble of a broadcast cutting in and out. At first, I shrugged it off. It was an old motel, and the signal was probably just bad. I sat on the bed, trying to relax. The fog pressed against the windows, making everything outside a swirl of gray. I listened to the muffled hum of the heater and the distant drip of water somewhere in the plumbing. Then, just as I was starting to scroll aimlessly on my phone, I noticed it. On the TV, just for a fraction of a second, the static seemed to resolve into a shape, a dark figure standing in the far corner of the room. My heart jumped, and I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the angle of the lamp. I turned fully to look, expecting to see a coat rack or a chair, but the corner was empty. I told myself it was the flickering of the screen, that the old TV sometimes reflected the room in strange ways. I tried to focus on something else, pressed buttons, fiddled with the antenna, anything to make it stop. But each time I turned away for even a second, it appeared again, blurry, just a shadowy shape that seemed to linger for a heartbeat longer than it should. I forced myself not to stare, not to imagine anything, and yet my eyes kept darting back toward it, catching glimpses at the edge of the screen. Hours passed. The fog outside grew thicker, pressing against the window like a living thing. The motel lot had emptied entirely. The lone pickup truck was gone, leaving the whole area feeling isolated, suspended between the world and nothing. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape in my mind's eye, stationary at first, then slowly shifting, ever so slightly closer. I could feel the pull of my imagination, the way fear builds in silence, in small, uncertain movements. I kept convincing myself that it was the angle of the light, the flicker of the old television, my own exhaustion twisting ordinary shadows into something menacing. By 3 a.m, I had stopped turning toward the corner at all. The TV continued to flicker, cutting in and out, and my peripheral vision caught the figure again and again. I stopped blinking, almost trying to catch it fully, but every time I thought I had, it seemed to blur and vanish. My stomach was tight with tension, my muscles coiled as though ready to spring. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it moving closer, or if I was simply projecting my own fear onto the shadows. I stayed on the bed, facing the wall, trying to convince myself that it was all an illusion, a trick of fatigue and bad reception. Eventually, I noticed something I hadn't before, a subtle pattern in the room itself. The lamp flickered in time with the TV, casting shadows that stretched toward the corners and recoiled. The dresser leaned slightly into the corner, the angle exaggerating the darkness behind it. The room ceiling light buzzed softly, causing the flicker in the TV to align with the strobe of electricity, producing that eerie, half-seen figure. Every detail I had noticed, the way the shadow seemed closer, the sense of movement, was a result of reflections, angles, and fatigue. The corner wasn't haunted. It was merely the interplay of old electronics, dim light, and my own heightened senses in the foggy isolation of the motel. By the time dawn came, the fog had lifted, and light spilled weakly through the curtains. I could see the motel lot clearly, empty and quiet, the peeling paint of the buildings illuminated for the first time in detail. The old TV, now steady with the morning signal, showed a clear, unremarkable broadcast. I moved the lamp slightly, leaned the dresser back into alignment, and the corner looked ordinary. The unease, the tension, and the sense of presence that had dominated the night dissolved into the mundane reality of an aging, poorly maintained motel room. I packed my things slowly, taking in the small details I had ignored in my initial rush. The scuffed baseboards, the worn carpet, the faint mildew smell behind the sink. Nothing about the room was extraordinary, nothing threatening. The entire night had been a careful construction of fear, built from ordinary elements magnified by my isolation and exhaustion. I checked out quickly, slipping the key into the clerk's hand without a word, and left the motel behind, the sun breaking through the fog in long, pale beams across the highway. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering awareness, the kind that comes from being alone somewhere unfamiliar and letting your mind fill in the blanks. I didn't need ghosts or monsters to feel fear that night. I had all the elements I needed in myself, in the quiet, in the flicker of an old television, and in the fog pressing against the windows. The motel had been just a building, a place suspended in time, but for those hours it became a crucible of my own perception, proving how easily the mind can turn ordinary shadows into something alive. The memory stayed with me, but it was no longer frightening. I understood what had happened, and that understanding left me steady, almost calm, as I drove back into the clarity of morning.